What's up, everyone? Sam here from ByteByByte.com, and today I want to talk about the distinction between things that are simple and things that are easy. And I'm also going to give you 3 specific strategies that you can use to make everything as easy as possible for you when you're studying for your interviews. All right, so today I really do want to dig into the difference between things that are simple and things that are easy, because I think that this is a distinction that is really valuable to make since we often conflate these two. And the fact of the matter is that things that are simple are not necessarily things that are easy, and things that are easy are also not necessarily things that are simple. And I want to give you a couple examples of this. So let's think about a couple things that might be simple, right? A simple thing might be starting a YouTube channel, or writing a book, or preparing for your coding interviews. They're things that we could define in a very simplistic way. And we know that, for example, if you wanted to write a book, all you gotta do is sit down and write it. There's really not very much to it, and it's not very complicated. So it's like simple, but it is not an easy thing to do, right? Because if it were easy for us to write a book, then how many countless people would have written books by now, right? So it's possible for something to be simple without it being easy, but then on the flip side, it's also possible for things to be easy without being simple. Like think about, for example, if you wanted to ride a bike. That's actually something that's fairly complicated, right? You know, you have to balance on the bike, you have to pedal, you have to steer, you have to do all these different things, but chances are, at least if you know how to ride a bike, it's really easy to do. Right? So just because it's complicated and there are a lot of moving pieces doesn't actually mean that it is difficult, but it isn't simple. And so the key distinction here, and one of the things that I thought was really interesting when I was researching this video, is that when we look at things that are simple versus things that are easy, we're basically looking at something that is objective versus something that is subjective. Right? So whether something is simple or not is fairly objective. It doesn't depend on our pre-existing skill. It doesn't require any pre-existing knowledge. It's just the way that it's defined is either simple or it's not. Whereas with something being easy, it is actually based on our past experience. It's based on what we know. It's based on how we have done things in the past. And so we have these two different things where we have something that is objectively simple, but not necessarily easy. And we have something that is subjectively easy, but not necessarily simple. And so the reason that I want to talk about this today is that I think this is really important for our coding interviews, and particularly for the specific things that we're studying as we're going through our coding interviews. Like the perfect example of this is recursion. Right? Because recursion itself is actually super simple. The idea of recursion is super simple. All recursion is that it's a function that calls itself. That's it. There's nothing more to it than that. And there's nothing more to understand than that at some fundamental level. But when we realize, when we go and actually start trying to apply recursion and use it in our interviews, it can become very difficult, right? Because it's not necessarily easy to actually apply this even though it's a simple concept. So like we learn how to do Fibonacci sequences. We learn how to do compute like powers of a number. We learn some of these basic things, but then we want to go and actually apply it in some more difficult context, and it becomes totally overwhelming, and it's not easy at all because we don't know what to do, and because it's simple, but it's not easy. And so for the rest of this video, what I want to do is I want to give you 3 specific strategies that you can use to make things that are simple also become easier. And the basic idea here is that things are easy because they relate to how our brain works and because they connect with how our brain works. Whereas things can be simple that don't actually align with the way that our brains function. And so these are going to be 3 strategies that you can use that will align the way that you were studying and the way that you were thinking about things with the way that your brain actually functions. And so the first thing that I would recommend trying out is a mnemonic. And so as you're probably familiar with, mnemonics are super helpful little like phrases or different things, different acronyms to remember information that is more complicated than what you're like actually memorizing. And so like a couple examples of this might be like if we're trying to remember the colors of the rainbow, we remember Roy G. Biv, right? Where it's red, orange, yellow, green, blue, violet. And so by remembering that acronym, we're able to remember those colors which are seemingly random. Another perfect example of this in the interviewing side would be the FAST method, which is a strategy that I talk about, and I'll link to our ebook as well so that you can grab that if you haven't seen it already. But basically, the idea of the FAST method is it's a strategy for solving dynamic programming problems. And what the FAST method is it's an acronym that stands for finding the first solution, analyzing that solution, identifying the subproblems, and turning around the solution. And so if I just told you to do those things, it's not that easy to remember, but by having that acronym, by calling it the FAST method, it becomes really easy for us to remember. And so mnemonics are a great tool when you're trying to remember things and when you're trying to contextualize what you're learning, especially if you're learning something that is very data driven or very mathematical, and it's not something where it's easy to remember. Like if you're just trying to remember a random number, creating some sort of mnemonic device is going to make it much easier for you to remember that number than just trying to remember the numbers. So strategy 1 is mnemonics. Strategy number 2 is a strategy called chunking. And this is a great tool, especially when we're talking about things that are simple versus easy. Because the thing with things that are simple is that oftentimes we are obscuring the complexity, right? Let's say that I talked about, it's really simple to write a book. You just sit down and write it. Well, that's true, except if we take a step back from there, what does just write it actually mean? Well, it means a lot of different things, and there are a lot of layers of complexity that are creating that, right? We need to understand grammar, we need to understand vocabulary, we need to understand how to construct interesting sentences, we need to understand the topic matter at hand, we need to be able to structure the book. There's so many layers to this that just the simple explanation of you just sit down and write doesn't capture. And so what chunking is a tool that allows us to really break things down into more granular pieces. And this is really useful because this is similar to how our brain works. So I want you to think about, let's use the example of writing a book, and let's say that you were going to write a book in a language that you had no familiarity with. Because if we're talking about English, it's probably you at least understand a lot of the basics here, but let's say that you wanted to write a book in Chinese, for example, and you don't speak Chinese. So what would you have to do? Well, you would start at the very fundamentals, right? You would start by studying the vocabulary. You would start by studying the basic grammar. These are individual chunks where you're saying, I'm going to focus my attention on this one little piece rather than looking at the larger whole. I'm not going to start by trying to write a book. I'm going to start by learning the vocabulary. And then as you learn the vocabulary and as you get better, the chunks in your mind start to get slightly bigger. So it starts with these chunks where it's each chunk is just an individual word. In Chinese, for example. Or it could even be an individual letter, depending on what the language is. And as we start to learn, our brain is able to connect these chunks together. And as we understand the language better, we're no longer thinking about it in terms of the individual words, but we start thinking in terms of phrases, or we start thinking in terms of sentences, because our brain is now doing that intuitively. Our brain makes these low-level connections so that we're able to do it without thinking. I'm not thinking about every word that I'm saying here. I'm thinking about the meaning and the overarching message, and that's how I'm conveying this to you. Right? It's not about thinking about the individual words, and so as you get better, those chunks get bigger. And let's think about this in terms of interviewing for a second. If you were going to chunk things down, you might chunk things down by saying, I'm going to start with basic syntax, and I'm going to learn this data structure, and I'm going to learn this specific algorithm. And then as you get better, your brain is able to combine those chunks together into the solution to an actual coding interview question, rather than just leaving it at let me try and piece together all these little chunks. And so chunking is also a really useful tool, and the way that you apply that is really as simple as just saying, let me take the big thing that I want to do and break it into smaller and smaller pieces. And now, the third technique that I want to mention today is process. And this is so valuable, and this I actually talked a little bit about when I was talking about the mnemonics, because if you remember the FAST method is like a step-by-step process for solving dynamic programming problems. And process can be so valuable for making things that are simple become easy, because it actually gives you a way to it's sort of combining mnemonics and chunking into like one thing. Where a process, you're breaking it down into discrete pieces in a way that is more easily understandable. And I think of process a lot like a recipe, right? If you're gonna go cook, you're gonna follow a recipe. And the recipe defines exactly the steps that you need to take and the specific chunks that you need to do in order to get to the result. And so like it might say, okay, chop the onion and heat the oil in the pan and, fry the beef. And it will add all these different steps, and by giving you this process, it makes it much easier to wrap your head around than the simple version, which would be like, make a steak for dinner. And so with these three ideas, with mnemonics, with chunking, and with process, it makes it it makes it so that we can take things that are simple and turn them into something that is easy. And when you're looking at your coding interviews, using these three strategies is going to be super helpful, because it's going to allow you to make this much more achievable rather than this big pie in the sky sort of idea. And so with that, that's all I got for you guys today. If you enjoyed this video, please hit subscribe below. And we do also have our 50 interview questions guide. So definitely check that out if you haven't already. And I look forward to seeing you guys in a few weeks.